The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Margaret Thompson adjusted her crisp uniform and checked her watch. As head of palace security, she took pride in maintaining the highest standards of protection for the royal family. The corridors were unusually quiet this Tuesday morning, with most of the senior royals attending various engagements throughout London. Margaret had been walking her regular patrol route when she noticed something unusual. The door to the Duchess of Cambridge's private chambers stood slightly ajar, which was highly irregular. Kate Middleton was known for her meticulous attention to detail, and leaving doors open was completely against protocol, especially in her personal quarters. Approaching carefully, Margaret could hear the faint sound of movement from within the room. Her training kicked in immediately. No one should have been in those chambers at this time. The Duchess was attending a charity event in Westminster, and her personal staff had been given explicit instructions not to enter the rooms until her return. Margaret pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe and listened intently. The sounds were deliberate but cautious. Someone was clearly searching through belongings. Papers rustled softly, and she could hear the quiet opening and closing of drawers. Her heart rate increased as she realized the gravity of the situation. Reaching for her radio with one hand while keeping the other near her emergency alert button, Margaret whispered into the device. "Control. This is Thompson. I have a potential security breach in the Duchess of Cambridge's private quarters, requesting immediate backup and maintaining surveillance position." The response crackled back immediately. "Copy that, Thompson. Backup units dispatched. Do not engage until support arrives. Maintain position and observe." Margaret knew she had to get a visual confirmation of who was inside. The palace had been dealing with increased security concerns lately, and any breach of the royal family's private spaces was treated with the utmost seriousness. She carefully positioned herself to peer through the slight gap in the doorway. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't an intruder or a member of staff acting suspiciously. It was Camilla, the Queen Consort herself, methodically going through Kate's personal belongings with an intensity that suggested she was searching for something specific. Camilla stood near Kate's writing desk, holding what appeared to be a bundle of letters. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by something more urgent, almost desperate. She was reading through correspondence with the kind of focus that suggested these weren't casual social letters. Margaret watched in stunned silence as Camilla moved from the desk to a small chest of drawers that Kate used for her personal jewelry and keepsakes. The Queen Consort was being careful not to disturb the arrangement of items too obviously, but she was clearly conducting a thorough search. The implications of what Margaret was witnessing began to sink in. This wasn't just any security breach, this was a member of the royal family potentially violating another family member's privacy in the most serious way possible. The protocol she had been trained for didn't exactly cover this scenario. Camilla picked up a small wooden box from the dresser and opened it carefully. Inside, Margaret could see what looked like more letters and possibly some photographs. The Queen Consort examined these items closely, her expression growing increasingly tense. Margaret's radio crackled softly again. "Thompson, backup units are 30 seconds out. What's your status?" She couldn't respond without potentially alerting Camilla to her presence. Instead, she continued to observe, trying to understand what could possibly be motivating this extraordinary breach of protocol and family trust. Camilla suddenly froze, as if she had heard something. Margaret held her breath, pressing herself further back against the wall. After a moment of tense silence, Camilla returned to her search, but with even greater urgency than before. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made Margaret's decision for her. Her backup was arriving, and she needed to take control of the situation before it escalated further. The potential diplomatic and family crisis that could result from this incident was enormous. Taking a deep breath, Margaret made her choice. She couldn't allow other guards to discover this scene without proper preparation. The implications for the royal family's reputation and internal relationships could be devastating if this wasn't handled with extreme care. She stepped into the doorway, making her presence known. "Your Majesty," she said quietly but firmly, "I'm going to need you to step away from those belongings and explain your presence in these chambers." Camilla spun around, her face immediately flushing with a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like relief at being caught. The letters in her hands scattered to the floor as she struggled to compose herself. "Margaret," Camilla said, her voice attempting to maintain royal authority despite the circumstances. "This is not what it appears to be. With respect, Your Majesty, my responsibility is to secure these chambers and protect all members of the royal family. I need to understand why you are here without permission, going through the Duchess of Cambridge's private belongings." The sound of multiple footsteps grew louder in the corridor. Margaret knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before her backup arrived, and this situation became much more complicated to manage discreetly. Camilla seemed to realize this as well. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment, she looked less like a queen consort and more like a woman who had been caught in an impossible situation. "There are things you don't understand," Camilla said quietly. "Important things that affect the entire family. I wasn't trying to invade Catherine's privacy. I was trying to protect everyone." Margaret maintained her professional composure while internally processing this unexpected explanation. "Your Majesty, I'm going to need you to put down anything you've taken from this room and step into the corridor. My colleagues are about to arrive, and we need to handle this situation appropriately." The footsteps were now just around the corner. Margaret could hear the quiet radio chatter of the approaching security team. She made a split-second decision that would define how this incident unfolded. "Your Majesty," she said quickly, "I'm going to ask my team to secure the perimeter while we discuss this privately. But I need your complete cooperation." Camilla nodded, carefully placing the remaining items she held back onto the dresser. As she did so, Margaret caught a glimpse of what appeared to be official correspondence, letters bearing various royal seals and what looked like legal documents. The backup team rounded the corner just as Margaret stepped fully into the doorway, effectively blocking their view into the room. "Secure the corridor," she instructed them. "I have the situation under control, but I need this area cleared of all non-essential personnel immediately." Her team, trained to follow her orders without question, quickly established a security perimeter around the entrance to Kate's chambers. Margaret knew this would buy her some time to understand what was really happening before this incident spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control. As the corridor cleared, Margaret turned back to face Camilla, who was now standing in the center of Kate's room, looking like someone whose carefully constructed world had just come crashing down around her. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm, "I think you need to tell me exactly what's going on here, because what happens next is going to depend entirely on whether I believe you're telling me the truth." Camilla looked at the scattered letters on the floor, then back at Margaret. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested whatever had brought her to this moment was far more serious than a simple invasion of privacy. "Margaret, what I'm about to tell you could change everything you think you know about this family. And once you hear it, there will be no going back for either of us." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of Margaret's team maintaining their positions in the corridor. Whatever was about to unfold, Margaret realized she was now at the center of something that would likely have consequences far beyond anything she had ever dealt with in her security career. She looked at Camilla, then at the evidence of the search scattered around Kate's room, and prepared herself for revelations that would challenge everything she thought she understood about the family she had sworn to protect. Margaret stood perfectly still, her years of training keeping her expression neutral despite the turmoil in her mind. Camilla's words hung in the air between them like a threat and a promise combined. The queen consort moved slowly toward one of Kate's elegant chairs and sat down heavily, as if the weight of whatever she was carrying had finally become too much to bear standing. 3 weeks ago, Camilla began, her voice barely above a whisper, I received information that could destroy not just Catherine, but potentially the entire monarchy as we know it. She gestured toward the scattered papers on the floor. Those letters contain evidence of communications that should never have existed. Margaret remained standing, her hand still near her radio, but her attention completely focused on Camilla's words. She had secured the corridor, but she knew this privacy was temporary. Soon, questions would be asked about why the queen consort was being detained in another royal's chambers. What kind of communications? Margaret asked, keeping her voice professional despite her growing concern about what she might be about to hear. Camilla reached down and picked up one of the fallen letters, handling it as if it were made of the most fragile glass. Communications between Catherine and certain individuals outside the royal family. Individuals whose relationships with the monarchy have been complicated, to say the least. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. In her years of royal protection, she had learned that the greatest threats to the monarchy often came not from external enemies, but from the complex web of relationships and loyalties within the extended royal circle itself. I need you to be more specific, Your Majesty. If there's a genuine security threat, I need to understand its nature, so I can protect everyone involved. Camilla stood up again, beginning to pace in the small space between Kate's bed and the window. The morning light streaming through the glass seemed to highlight every line of stress and worry on her face. 6 months ago, Catherine began corresponding with Marcus Whitfield. Do you know that name, Margaret? Margaret's professional mask slipped for just a moment. Marcus Whitfield was indeed a name she knew, a former royal correspondent who had been quietly blacklisted from official events after publishing several articles that came uncomfortably close to revealing sensitive information about the family's private affairs. I'm familiar with Mr. Whitfield, Margaret said carefully, but I'm not aware of any current security concerns regarding him. That's because you don't know what I know, Camilla said, her voice growing stronger as she seemed to find her resolve. Whitfield didn't just stumble onto those stories 6 months ago. He had inside information. Very specific, very detailed inside information that could only have come from someone with intimate access to our private family matters. The implications began to form in Margaret's mind, but she pushed them away, focusing on facts rather than speculation. Are you suggesting that the Duchess of Cambridge has been providing information to a journalist? I'm not suggesting it, Camilla said flatly. I'm telling you that these letters prove it. Catherine has been feeding Whitfield information for months. Personal family details, private conversations, internal discussions about royal duties and responsibilities, things that were never meant to be shared with anyone outside our immediate circle. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. If what Camilla was saying was true, it represented not just a betrayal of family trust, but potentially a serious breach of the security protocols that governed how sensitive royal information was handled. Why would she do such a thing? Margaret asked, though part of her training told her that understanding motive was less important than understanding threat level. Camilla stopped pacing and turned to face Margaret directly. Because Catherine has never truly accepted her role in this family. She's always felt like an outsider, always believed that she was somehow less important than those of us who were born into this life. These communications with Whitfield weren't just about sharing information. They were about revenge. Margaret processed this carefully. She had always observed Kate as one of the most dedicated and professional members of the royal family. The idea that she harbored such deep resentment seemed inconsistent with everything Margaret had witnessed over the years. Your Majesty, these are serious accusations. If you have evidence of security breaches, there are proper channels for reporting such concerns. Why did you come here to search through the Duchess's belongings rather than following protocol? Camilla's composure cracked slightly. Because I don't know who else I can trust. If Catherine has been sharing our private family information with a journalist, how do I know she hasn't compromised other people as well? How do I know that anyone in our official channels is safe? Margaret understood the paranoia, but it didn't justify what had happened here. So you decided to investigate on your own. I had to know the extent of it, Camilla said, moving back toward the scattered letters. I needed to understand what she had shared, what damage had already been done, and most importantly, whether she was planning to share anything else. Margaret watched as Camilla picked up another document from the floor. This one appeared to be different from the others. More official-looking with what appeared to be a royal seal at the top. What is that document? Margaret asked. Camilla hesitated for a long moment before responding. This is where things become even more complicated. Catherine didn't just share family gossip with Whitfield. She shared information about official royal business, confidential discussions about state matters, private communications with government officials, details about security protocols. Margaret's training kicked into high gear. If state security had been compromised, this was no longer just a family matter. This was a potential national security issue that required immediate escalation to the highest levels of both royal protection and government security services. Your Majesty, if what you're telling me is true, we need to involve additional authorities immediately. This kind of breach requires investigation by specialists who are trained to handle sensitive political information. No! Camilla said sharply. That's exactly what we cannot do. The moment this becomes official, the moment investigators get involved, this entire situation becomes public. And if it becomes public, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret understood the implications perfectly. A scandal involving a senior royal family member sharing state secrets with journalists would be devastating not just for the individuals involved, but for the monarchy's reputation and the government's confidence in royal discretion. But we can't just ignore it either, Margaret pointed out. If there's been a genuine breach of security protocols, people need to know so they can take appropriate protective measures. Camilla sat down again, this time covering her face with her hands. I've been trying to figure out how to handle this for weeks. Every option seems to lead to disaster. If we report it officially, the scandal destroys Catherine and potentially brings down the entire institution. If we don't report it, we leave ourselves vulnerable to whatever Whitfield might publish next. Margaret began to understand why Camilla had taken such desperate measures. The Queen Consort was trapped between protecting the institution she served and protecting the family she had married into. Have you spoken to anyone else about this? The King? Prince William? Charles knows something is wrong, but I haven't told him the details yet. And William? Camilla shook her head. How do you tell a man that his wife has betrayed not just the family, but potentially the country itself? The sound of voices in the corridor reminded Margaret that their private conversation couldn't continue indefinitely. Her security team would be growing concerned about the extended delay, and soon questions would be asked that would be difficult to answer without revealing what had transpired here. Your Majesty, we need to make some decisions very quickly. My team is going to expect an explanation for what happened here, and whatever we decide will determine how this situation develops from here. Camilla looked up at Margaret with an expression of desperate hope. What are my options? Margaret considered carefully before responding. We can treat this as a family matter and handle it internally, but that means accepting responsibility for managing whatever security risks might exist. Or we can follow proper protocols and report the potential breach, but that means accepting that this will likely become a much larger investigation. And if we handle it internally, then we need to confront the Duchess directly, understand the full extent of what's been shared, and develop a strategy for preventing any future breaches. But Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. That also means we're taking personal responsibility for any consequences if this situation escalates further. Camilla stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where tourists were already beginning to gather for the day's activities.
Those people out there believe in us.
They believe that we represent something stable and trustworthy in an uncertain world. If it comes out, it will be handled, Margaret said firmly. But right now we need to focus on preventing it from coming out, while we determine what actually happened and how to address it. Camilla turned back from the window. What do you recommend? Margaret took a deep breath. I recommend we secure all of these documents immediately, document everything we've found here, and arrange a private meeting with the Duchess as soon as possible. We need to hear her side of this story before we make any final decisions about how to proceed. And if her side of the story confirms what these letters suggest, then we'll deal with that when we know for certain what we're dealing with. But first, we need to get you out of this room and these documents secured before anyone else discovers what's happened here. Camilla nodded slowly. How do we explain your team's presence here? We received a report of suspicious activity and conducted a routine security check. Nothing was found to be amiss. Standard protocol. And the truth about what really happened here? Margaret looked around the room, at the evidence of the search, at the scattered letters that could potentially change everything about how the royal family functioned. The truth stays between us until we understand exactly what we're dealing with and how to handle it properly. But Your Majesty, Margaret's voice became very serious. This is only the beginning. Whatever decisions we make in the next few hours will determine not just how this situation unfolds, but whether we can maintain control of it at all. Camilla gathered up the remaining documents from Kate's dresser and handed them to Margaret. Then I suppose we'd better make the right decisions. Margaret accepted the papers, realizing that in doing so, she was accepting responsibility for one of the most delicate and potentially explosive situations she had ever encountered in her career. Whatever happened next would test not just her professional abilities, but her loyalty to both the institution she served and the individuals she was sworn to protect. 2 hours later, Margaret stood outside the conference room she had quietly reserved in the palace's administrative wing. The documents she had collected from Kate's chambers were now secured in a locked briefcase at her side, and she had spent the intervening time carefully planning how to approach what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of her career. Camilla had agreed to wait in Margaret's office while the security chief arranged for Kate to be quietly redirected from her planned afternoon appointments. The official story was that there had been a minor security concern that required the Duchess's immediate attention. It wasn't entirely untrue, though it vastly understated the gravity of the situation. Margaret checked her watch. Kate would arrive in 10 minutes, and Margaret still wasn't entirely certain how to begin a conversation that would essentially amount to accusing a senior member of the royal family of betraying state secrets. Her years of training had prepared her for many scenarios, but none quite like this. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Kate entered the room looking concerned but composed. She was still wearing the elegant blue dress she had chosen for her morning charity engagement, and her expression suggested she was expecting to hear about a routine security matter rather than a personal crisis. "Margaret, I came as soon as I received your message. Is everything all right? Your assistant mentioned there was some kind of urgent security issue." Margaret gestured toward one of the chairs around the conference table. "Please, Your Royal Highness, have a seat. We do need to discuss a security matter, but it's somewhat more complicated than I initially indicated." Kate sat down, her concern evident. "Is William all right? The children?" "Prince William and the children are fine," Margaret assured her. "This matter concerns you directly." Margaret took her own seat across from Kate and placed the briefcase on the table between them. She had decided during her planning time that direct honesty, however difficult, would be more effective than attempting to ease into the subject gradually. "Your Royal Highness, this morning I discovered Queen Consort Camilla conducting an unauthorized search of your private chambers. When I confronted her about this breach of protocol, she made certain allegations regarding your correspondence with individuals outside the royal family." Kate's expression shifted from concern to confusion to something approaching alarm. "I'm sorry, what? Camilla was in my rooms? Going through my personal belongings?" She was looking for evidence to support her belief that you have been sharing confidential family and state information with Marcus Whitfield, the former royal correspondent. The color drained from Kate's face. She sat back in her chair as if she had been physically struck. "She told you about Marcus?" Margaret felt a sinking sensation. Kate's reaction suggested that Camilla's allegations weren't entirely unfounded. "So you acknowledge that you have been in communication with Mr. Purder, Whitfield?" Kate closed her eyes for a long moment before responding. "Yes, I have been corresponding with Marcus. But it's not what Camilla thinks. It's not what anyone would think." "Then please explain to me what it is, because right now I'm holding documents that suggest you've been providing him with sensitive information about royal family matters." Kate opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret. "Marcus is my cousin."
Margaret blinked, not certain she had heard correctly.
"Your cousin?" "My second cousin, actually, on my mother's side. We grew up together, spent holidays together when we were children. His real name is Marcus Middleton Whitfield. He adopted the shorter version professionally to avoid any appearance of trading on family connections." Margaret processed this information carefully. "So your correspondence with him is personal rather than professional?" "Initially, yes. We reconnected about a year ago when he reached out after my father's health scare. We started exchanging letters the way we used to when we were younger. Just family news, personal updates, that sort of thing. But Margaret could sense there was more to the story. Kate stood up and walked to the window, much as Camilla had done earlier. "But Marcus is also an investigative journalist, and he's very good at his job. Over the course of our correspondence, He began to pick up on things I mentioned casually: family tensions, concerns about how certain situations were being handled, frustrations with protocol and procedure. Margaret began to understand how an innocent family correspondence could have evolved into something more problematic, and he began asking more specific questions. He began asking the right questions, Kate said, turning back to face Margaret. Questions about how decisions are made in this family, about who really has influence and power, about how conflicts are resolved behind closed doors. And you answered those questions? Kate returned to her seat, her composure returning as she seemed to find her footing in explaining her actions. I answered them because Marcus helped me understand that some of the things happening in this family aren't normal, Margaret. They're not healthy, and they're not necessarily in the best interests of the institution we're all supposed to be serving. Margaret leaned forward slightly. What kinds of things? Do you know how major family decisions are actually made? Do you know who really influences policy and public engagements and even government relationships? Because I can tell you that what happens behind closed doors is very different from what the public believes happens. Margaret felt the conversation shifting into dangerous territory. Your Royal Highness, if there are concerns about internal family dynamics, there are appropriate channels for addressing those concerns. Are there? Kate's voice carried a note of frustration that Margaret had never heard from her before. Because I've tried those channels, Margaret. I've tried speaking to William, to Charles, to the private secretaries, to anyone who would listen. And what I learned is that the channels only work if you're saying what certain people want to hear. So you decided to share your concerns with a journalist instead? I shared my concerns with my cousin, who happens to be a journalist. There's a difference. Margaret opened the briefcase and removed several of the documents she had collected from Kate's room. These letters suggest that your concerns included specific details about private royal family discussions, confidential government communications, and internal security protocols. Kate looked at the papers Margaret had spread on the table. May I see those? Margaret hesitated before sliding the documents across to Kate. She watched carefully as the Duchess read through her own correspondence, looking for any signs of deception or evasion. After several minutes, Kate looked up. I can see how these might be misinterpreted if you don't understand the full context. Then provide the context. Kate chose one of the letters and held it up. This one mentions a private conversation between Charles and certain government ministers about trade policy. Camilla probably sees that as me sharing state secrets, but what actually happened was that I was excluded from that meeting despite the fact that it directly affected charitable organizations I work with. When I asked William why I wasn't included, he told me it was because Charles didn't think I would understand the complexities involved. Margaret listened carefully, trying to distinguish between legitimate grievances and genuine security concerns. So when I mentioned this to Marcus, it was because I was frustrated about being marginalized, not because I was trying to leak government policy. But Marcus understood immediately that this was part of a larger pattern of how women in this family are treated. Kate picked up another letter. And this one, where I mentioned security protocols, wasn't me sharing sensitive information. It was me describing how those protocols are used to control and limit what family members can do, say, and even think. But surely you understand that regardless of your intent, sharing these details with someone outside the family creates security risks? Of course I understand that. But I also understand that remaining silent about these issues creates different kinds of risks. Risks to my own well-being, risks to my children's future in this family, and frankly, risks to the long-term health of the monarchy itself. Margaret found herself in the unusual position of understanding both sides of an argument that seemed to have no clear resolution. So what exactly were you hoping to achieve through these communications with your cousin? Kate considered her response carefully. I was hoping to find someone who could help me understand whether what I was experiencing was normal, whether my concerns were valid, and whether there might be ways to address the problems I was seeing without compromising my loyalty to the institution. And what did you conclude? I concluded that this family has some very serious problems that no one wants to acknowledge, let alone address. Problems with power dynamics, with transparency, with accountability, and with how conflicts are managed. Problems that affect not just those of us who live with them daily, but potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. Margaret sat back in her chair, processing everything she had heard, and Camilla found evidence of these communications and concluded that you were deliberately betraying family confidences. Camilla found evidence that I was thinking independently and speaking honestly about my experiences. Given her own position in this family's power structure, I suppose it's understandable that she would interpret that as betrayal. The room fell silent as both women considered the implications of what had been revealed. Margaret realized that this situation was far more complex than a simple case of information security. It was about fundamental questions of loyalty, transparency, and power within one of the world's most scrutinized institutions. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said finally, "regardless of the underlying family dynamics involved, the fact remains that confidential information was shared with an individual. That creates security vulnerabilities that I'm obligated to address." Kate nodded. "I understand that. And I'm prepared to accept responsibility for any security risks my actions may have created. But I want you to understand that those actions were motivated by genuine concerns about problems that still exist and still need to be addressed." Margaret gathered the documents back into a neat stack. "What I need to know now is whether there are any other communications, any other people you've shared information with, any other security concerns I should be aware of." "No other people," Kate said firmly. "Just Marcus. And as for the communications, what you have there represents the full extent of our correspondence about family matters. And moving forward?" Kate met Margaret's gaze directly. "Moving forward, I think it's time for this family to have some honest conversations about how we function, how we make decisions, and how we treat each other. Conversations that should probably have happened a long time ago." Margaret realized that her role in this situation was evolving beyond simple security management. She was now at the center of what appeared to be a fundamental conflict about how the royal family operated and what kinds of changes might be necessary to ensure its continued viability. "Your Royal Highness, I need to brief Camilla on this conversation, and depending on her response, we may need to involve other family members in resolving this situation." Kate stood up from the table. "Margaret, whatever happens next, I want you to know that I never intended to put anyone at risk. But I also can't pretend that the problems I've been trying to address don't exist just because acknowledging them creates complications." As Kate left the conference room, Margaret remained seated, staring at the documents that had started this entire crisis. She realized that regardless of how this situation was ultimately resolved, the royal family would never be quite the same again. Margaret spent the next hour in her office, trying to process the afternoon's revelations, while preparing for what she suspected would be an even more challenging conversation with Camilla. The Queen Consort had been waiting patiently, but Margaret could see through her office window that Camilla was growing increasingly anxious as the minutes ticked by. When Margaret finally invited Camilla back into the conference room, the older woman's composure was noticeably strained. Well, what did Catherine have to say for herself? Margaret had decided to present Kate's explanation as thoroughly and fairly as possible, regardless of her own growing concerns about the family dynamics that had been revealed. She acknowledged the correspondence with Marcus Whitfield, but provided significant context that changes the nature of the situation. What kind of context could possibly justify sharing confidential family information with a journalist? Margaret explained Kate's family relationship with Whitfield, her stated motivations for the correspondence, and her perspective on the issues that had prompted her to seek outside counsel. She watched Camilla's expression carefully throughout the explanation, noting how the Queen Consort's initial relief at having her suspicions confirmed gradually shifted to something more complicated. When Margaret finished, Camilla sat in silence for several minutes before responding. "So Catherine believes that her frustrations with family dynamics justify compromising our security protocols? She believes that certain family dynamics represent problems that need to be addressed, and that she was seeking advice from a trusted family member about how to navigate those problems constructively. And you believe her?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I believe she's telling me what she understands to be true about her motivations and actions. Whether that represents the complete picture of the security implications is something we still need to determine." Camilla stood up and began pacing again, a habit that Margaret was beginning to recognize as the Queen Consort's way of managing stress. "Margaret, I need you to understand something about Catherine's concerns regarding family dynamics." "I'm listening." Catherine has been a member of this family for over a decade. During that time, she has been consistently treated with respect, given significant autonomy in her charitable work, and supported through every challenge she's faced. The idea that she's somehow been marginalized or silenced is simply not consistent with reality. Margaret remained neutral. What do you believe motivated her communications with her cousin then? Camilla stopped pacing and turned to face Margaret directly. Ambition. Catherine has always believed that she should have more influence than her position naturally provides. She's frustrated that major decisions are made by those of us who have been serving this institution for decades, and she's resentful that her opinions don't carry the same weight as those with more experience and deeper understanding of how the monarchy functions. So you see her correspondence as an attempt to gain leverage rather than an attempt to address legitimate concerns. I see it as an attempt to build external alliances that could be used to pressure the family into giving her more power and influence than she has earned through experience and service. Margaret found herself in the middle of two completely different interpretations of the same set of facts. Kate saw herself as seeking guidance about how to address institutional problems. Camilla saw her as attempting to manipulate the institution for personal gain. Your Majesty, regardless of the underlying motivations, we still need to address the security implications of what's happened. Confidential information was shared, and that creates vulnerabilities we can't ignore. And that's why this situation needs to be escalated immediately to the highest levels. The king needs to know what's happened. Prince William needs to know what his wife has done, and appropriate measures need to be taken to prevent any similar breaches in the future. Margaret felt a growing sense of unease. What kind of measures are you referring to? Catherine clearly cannot be trusted with sensitive information. Her access to confidential family discussions and government communications needs to be restricted until we can be certain that she understands the seriousness of what she's done and has taken appropriate steps to prevent any recurrence. And if she refuses to accept such restrictions? Camilla's expression hardened. Then she needs to understand that her position in this family is contingent on her ability to fulfill her responsibilities appropriately, including her responsibility to protect the institution she married into. Margaret realized that the situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage it quietly. Your Majesty, those are decisions that go well beyond my authority as head of security. If you want to impose restrictions on the Duchess of Cambridge's access to information, or her role in family activities, that requires involvement from the King and Prince William. Then we need to involve them immediately. Margaret hesitated. Before we take that step, I think we should consider the broader implications of what such an escalation might mean for the family and for the institution.
What do you mean?
I mean that once this becomes a formal family crisis involving the king and the heir to the throne, it becomes much more difficult to manage discreetly. And if it can't be managed discreetly, it becomes a potential public relations crisis as well. Camilla considered this for a moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we explore whether there might be ways to address the legitimate security concerns, while also addressing some of the underlying issues that motivated the Duchess's actions in the first place. You think Catherine's concerns about family dynamics are legitimate? Margaret chose her words very carefully. I think that when a senior member of the royal family feels compelled to seek outside counsel about her role and responsibilities, that suggests there may be communication issues that could be addressed through internal means, rather than disciplinary measures. Camilla sat back down, her expression thoughtful but skeptical. What kind of internal means? Perhaps a family meeting where everyone can discuss their concerns openly and work toward solutions that address both the security issues and the relationship issues that seem to have contributed to this situation. You want me to sit down with Catherine and pretend that her betrayal of our trust is actually a legitimate grievance that deserves to be negotiated? I want you to consider whether treating this as a betrayal might create more problems than treating it as a misunderstanding that can be resolved through better communication. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see her weighing different approaches to a problem that clearly had no perfect solutions. Margaret, there's something else you need to know before we decide how to proceed. What's that? This isn't the first time Catherine has caused problems within the family. There have been other incidents, other situations where her judgment has been questionable, and her loyalty has been suspect. Margaret felt her heart sink. What kind of incidents? 6 months ago, Catherine made several public statements that contradicted established family positions on charitable giving priorities. When she was asked to clarify her comments, she refused and said that she had the right to express her own views on matters that affected her work. That sounds like a disagreement about public messaging rather than a security issue. It was a public contradiction of family policy by someone who's supposed to represent family unity, and when Charles tried to address it privately with her, she accused him of trying to control her speech and threatened to take the conversation public if he continued to pressure her. Margaret began to see why Camilla viewed Kate's correspondence with Marcus Whitfield as part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated incident. Have there been other similar situations? Several. Catherine has consistently pushed against established protocols, questioned decisions that have been made by more senior family members, and expressed frustration with what she calls outdated approaches to royal duties and responsibilities. And how have these situations been resolved? They haven't been resolved. They've been managed. We've accommodated her concerns when possible and worked around her objections when accommodation wasn't feasible. But the pattern of behavior has continued, and, as we've now discovered, has escalated to the point where she's sharing our private family business with outsiders. Margaret realized that her initial assessment of this situation as an isolated security incident had been overly simplistic. What she was dealing with was apparently a long-standing conflict between different visions of how the royal family should function, and the correspondence with Marcus Whitfield was just the latest manifestation of deeper disagreements. Your Majesty, if this is part of a larger pattern, then perhaps the approach should be to address the pattern rather than just this specific incident. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for a comprehensive family discussion about roles, responsibilities, decision-making processes, and communication protocols. A discussion that addresses both the security concerns and the underlying issues that seem to be creating ongoing tensions. Camilla looked skeptical. And you think Catherine would participate constructively in such a discussion? I think she might, if it were structured as an opportunity to address legitimate concerns rather than as a disciplinary proceeding. And if she doesn't, if she continues to push against established protocols and family decisions, Margaret realized she was being asked to help navigate issues that went far beyond security management into fundamental questions about how the monarchy adapted to changing circumstances and different perspectives. Then at least you'll have given her the opportunity to work within the system before concluding that she's unwilling or unable to do so. Camilla stood up again, but this time her pacing seemed more thoughtful than agitated. Margaret, if we proceed with this approach, and if it doesn't work, the consequences could be significant for everyone involved. And if we don't try this approach, and instead escalate directly to disciplinary measures, the consequences could be even more significant. You really believe that family discussion and better communication can resolve what amounts to a fundamental disagreement about how this institution should function? Margaret looked at the documents on the table, evidence of a crisis that had emerged from what started as family frustrations and had evolved into potential security breaches. I believe it's worth trying before we conclude that the disagreements are irreconcilable. Because if they are irreconcilable, the consequences will extend far beyond any of us in this room. Camilla stopped pacing and looked directly at Margaret. All right, but if we're going to try this approach, we're going to need to involve Charles and William from the beginning. This can't be resolved by the three of us alone. Margaret nodded, realizing that she had just committed herself and everyone else involved to a process that could either resolve the crisis or make it much worse. When do you want to arrange the family meeting?
As soon as possible.
Before anyone has time to reconsider, or before any more information leaks to people who shouldn't have access to it. As Camilla left the conference room, Margaret remained behind to secure the documents and prepare for what she suspected would be the most challenging conversation of her career. A conversation that would determine not just how this immediate crisis was resolved, but how the royal family adapted to pressures and changes that weren't going to disappear regardless of how this particular situation was handled. The family meeting was arranged for the following afternoon in the king's private study at Clarence House. Margaret had spent the morning preparing a comprehensive briefing document that outlined the security concerns, the family dynamics involved, and potential approaches for moving forward. She understood that her role in the meeting would be to provide professional perspective while remaining carefully neutral about the personal relationships involved. When she arrived at Clarence's house, Margaret was surprised to find that the atmosphere was tense but not hostile. King Charles was already seated behind his desk, reviewing the briefing materials Margaret had provided earlier. Prince William sat in one of the chairs facing the desk, his expression serious but controlled. Camilla occupied another chair, and Kate sat slightly apart from the others, her posture suggesting she was prepared for a difficult conversation but not entirely defensive. "Margaret," King Charles said as she entered, "thank you for your thorough preparation of this briefing. Before we discuss how to move forward, I want to understand exactly what security protocols were compromised and what risks we're currently facing." Margaret took her seat and opened her folder. "Your Majesty, based on my review of the correspondence in question, confidential family information was shared, but there's no evidence that state security was directly compromised. The information shared primarily concerned internal family dynamics, decision-making processes, and the Duchess's personal experiences within the royal household. But information about government communications was included," Camilla interjected. "References to government communications were included, but those references were primarily about access and inclusion rather than policy details or sensitive government information." King Charles looked at William. "What's your understanding of your wife's motivations for these communications?" William glanced at Kate before responding. "Based on our conversations over the past 24 hours, I believe Catherine was genuinely seeking guidance about how to navigate what she perceived as challenging family dynamics. I don't believe she intended to compromise anyone's security or create institutional problems. But she did create institutional problems," Camilla said, "whether she intended to or not." Kate spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "I accept full responsibility for the security concerns my actions created, but I also hope we can discuss the issues that motivated those actions." King Charles set down the briefing document and looked around the room at each person present. "It seems to me that we have two separate but related problems. First, we have a security issue that needs to be addressed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Second, we have communication and relationship issues within the family that may have contributed to the circumstances that led to the security incident." Margaret nodded. "That's an accurate assessment, Your Majesty. Then let's address the security issues first, and then discuss whether and how we might address the underlying family concerns." William leaned forward slightly. "What security measures are you recommending?" Margaret consulted her notes. "I recommend that all family members receive updated briefings on information security protocols, including clear guidance about what kinds of information can be shared with family members outside the immediate royal household. I also recommend that we establish clearer channels for family members to raise concerns about institutional matters before they feel compelled to seek outside counsel." "That sounds reasonable," Charles said. "Camilla, do you have concerns about those recommendations?" "I think they're appropriate as far as they go, but I'm concerned about whether Catherine understands the seriousness of what happened and is committed to preventing similar incidents in the future." Kate responded directly to Camilla. "I understand the seriousness completely, and I'm committed to following whatever security protocols are necessary. But I also need to know that if I have legitimate concerns about family matters in the future, there will be appropriate ways to address those concerns internally." Charles looked at William again. "What kinds of concerns is Catherine referring to?" William hesitated before answering. "She's felt that her input on family decisions has been discounted or ignored, and that she's been excluded from discussions that affect her charitable work and public responsibilities." Camilla's expression became defensive. "Catherine has been included in every discussion that was appropriate for her level of experience and responsibility." "But who determines what's appropriate?" Kate asked. "And what recourse do I have if I believe those determinations are incorrect or unfair?" Margaret realized that the conversation was moving into exactly the territory that had created the original problem. "Your Majesty, perhaps this is an opportunity to clarify decision-making processes and establish clearer communication protocols for the future." Charles considered this suggestion carefully. What would such protocols look like? Margaret had anticipated this question. They might include regular family meetings to discuss upcoming decisions and their implications, clearer criteria for determining who should be included in various types of discussions, and established procedures for raising concerns or objections when family members believe they should have input on decisions that affect their work or responsibilities. "That sounds like it could be helpful," William said. "It would certainly prevent misunderstandings about why someone was or wasn't included in particular discussions." Camilla looked skeptical. "And what happens when family members disagree about decisions even after they've been included in the discussions?" Kate answered before anyone else could respond. "Then we disagree openly and work toward compromises where possible, rather than pretending that disagreements don't exist and hoping they'll resolve themselves. But ultimately, someone has to have final authority to make decisions," Camilla pointed out. "Absolutely, but having final authority doesn't mean that authority can't be exercised in ways that are transparent and inclusive." Margaret watched the family members work through these issues and realized that the crisis had created an opportunity for conversations that probably should have happened years earlier. "Your Majesty," she said, "it might be helpful to document whatever protocols you agree on, both to ensure consistency going forward and to provide clear expectations for all family members." Charles nodded. "That's an excellent suggestion. William, would you be willing to work with Margaret to develop a draft protocol document for family review?" "Of course." Kate looked around the room at each person present. "I want to apologize again for the security concerns my actions created, but I also want to say that I'm grateful we're having this conversation because I think it will help prevent similar problems in the future. Catherine, I need to understand that you're committed not just to following security protocols, but to working within whatever family communication processes we establish, rather than seeking outside counsel when you have concerns." "I'm committed to that, as long as the internal processes provide genuine opportunities to address legitimate concerns rather than just opportunities to be heard before decisions that have already been made are announced." Charles stood up, signaling that the formal portion of the meeting was concluding. "It sounds like we have the foundation for moving forward constructively. Margaret, how quickly can you and William develop a draft communication protocol for our review?" "Within a week, Your Majesty, assuming Prince William's schedule permits." "Good. And I want us to meet again in 2 weeks to review the draft and make any necessary adjustments." As the meeting broke up, Margaret gathered her materials and prepared to leave. But Camilla approached her before she could exit. "Margaret, I want you to know that I appreciate how you handled this situation. It would have been easy to escalate it immediately to formal disciplinary measures, but your approach has given us an opportunity to address the underlying issues constructively." "Thank you, Your Majesty. I hope the protocols we develop will prevent similar situations in the future." Kate also approached Margaret as she was preparing to leave. "Margaret, I know this put you in a very difficult position, and I'm grateful for your professionalism and fairness throughout the process. Your Royal Highness, I hope you understand that my primary concern was protecting both the security of the family and the relationships within the family. Sometimes those priorities can conflict, but in this case I believe we found an approach that addresses both." As Margaret left Clarence's house, she reflected on how a crisis that had begun with a security breach had evolved into an opportunity for the royal family to establish clearer communication processes and more transparent decision-making procedures. The correspondence with Marcus Whitfield had revealed genuine family tensions, but addressing those tensions openly had ultimately strengthened the family's ability to function effectively. 6 months later, Margaret reviewed the communication protocols that had been implemented following the crisis. Family meetings were now held monthly, with clear agendas and opportunities for all members to raise concerns or suggestions. Decision-making processes had been clarified, with specific criteria for determining who should be included in various types of discussions. And perhaps most importantly, family members had established procedures for addressing disagreements constructively rather than allowing them to fester until they erupted into crises. The security incident that had started everything had been resolved without any public revelation or external investigation. Marcus Whitfield had agreed to maintain complete confidentiality about his correspondence with Kate, understanding that any breach of that confidentiality would affect not just the royal family, but his own family relationships as well. Kate had fulfilled her commitment to follow enhanced security protocols, and had found that the new family communication processes provided the kinds of opportunities for input and influence that she had been seeking. Camilla had come to understand that Kate's concerns about family dynamics had been motivated by genuine desire to contribute effectively rather than by ambition or disloyalty. Most importantly, the family had learned that addressing conflicts openly and constructively was more effective than managing them through informal accommodation and avoidance. The crisis had been painful, but it had ultimately made the royal family more resilient and more capable of adapting to future challenges. Margaret's final report on the incident concluded with a recommendation that similar communication protocols be considered for other royal households, and that regular reviews of family dynamics be conducted to identify potential problems before they escalated to crisis levels. As she filed the report away, Margaret realized that her role as head of security now included not just protecting the royal family from external threats, but helping them protect themselves from the kinds of internal conflicts that could be just as damaging to the institution they all served. The room where it had all begun, Kate's private chambers, had been returned to its normal state within hours of the crisis being discovered. But the conversations that had started there had changed the royal family permanently, creating new foundations for trust, communication, and mutual respect that would serve them well in facing whatever challenges the future might bring. Margaret checked her schedule for the next day and smiled slightly as she saw that it included the monthly family meeting she now attended as a regular observer. What had started as the most challenging crisis of her career had evolved into one of her most significant contributions to the long-term security and stability of the institution she had sworn to protect.